The air in the Monongahela National Forest didn't just carry the scent of pine and damp earth, it carried the heavy, metallic weight of copper and old iron. Michael DaCosta stood at the edge of the clearing, his boots sinking into the black, anaerobic mud of the Appalachian Hollow. The silence here was not the absence of sound, but a physical pressure, a thick woolen blanket draped over the mountains that muffled the very heartbeat of the world. It was a 4 p.m. gloom that felt like midnight, where the ancient hemlocks reached up like skeletal fingers to bruise the charcoal sky. Michael wiped a bead of cold sweat from his temple, his hand trembling with a fine, rhythmic palsy he couldn't suppress. Every breath felt like inhaling wet silt. He was back in West Virginia, back in the belly of the beast that had swallowed his career and his sanity 3 years ago. He shifted the weight of his pack, the nylon straps groaning against his Gore-Tex jacket, a sound that seemed blasphemously loud in the oppressive stillness. To any outsider, this was the majestic American wilderness, a postcard of rugged beauty. To Michael, it was a cemetery of biological anomalies. He began his trek toward the family cabin, a structure of rotting cedar and rusted tin that sat perched on the edge of a limestone sinkhole. His mind was a fractured mirror, reflecting the same image over and over, the Ridge incident, where he'd seen something the university had called a hallucination induced by localized methane pockets. But methane didn't leave 3-inch deep serrated gouges in solid oak. Methane didn't scream in a frequency that shattered the glass of his goggles. As he moved deeper into the hollow, the vegetation began to change. The vibrant greens of the laurel thickets faded into a sickly, translucent gray. The leaves felt like damp parchment, lacking the waxy resilience of healthy flora. Michael knelt to examine a cluster of ghost pipes, white parasitic plants that thrive in the dark. But these weren't standard Monotropa uniflora. These were pulsing. A faint rhythmic throb vibrated through the soil, a low-frequency hum that Michael felt in his molars more than he heard in his ears. He touched the stem of one plant, and it didn't break. It yielded like soft, muscular tissue. He withdrew his hand, a primal jolt of electricity shooting up his spine. This wasn't botany. This was something else entirely, a subterranean metabolism that had replaced the root systems of the forest. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Alleghenies, leaving the world in a bruised violet twilight. The cabin door was ajar, the wood splintered around the lock. Michael pulled his serrated survival knife, the steel cold and grounding in his grip. He expected a squatter or a black bear, but the interior was untouched by traditional scavengers. Instead, the floorboards were covered in a fine white powder that smelled of ozone and bleached bone. In the center of the room sat his old wooden table, and atop it lay a gift. It was a white-tailed deer, or what remained of one. The creature had been meticulously disassembled and reassembled. Its rib cage had been inverted, flared out like the petals of a morbid flower, and his skull had been polished until it shone like porcelain. There was no blood. Every drop of fluid had been vacuumed out, leaving the meat a pale, desiccated pink. Michael's stomach lurched. He leaned against the doorframe, the nausea hitting him in waves. This was a message, a surgical, biological statement. As he stared at the Bloom stag, he noticed something that stopped his heart. The stag's lungs, despite being exposed to the open air, were still moving. They were inflating and deflating in a slow, agonizing rhythm, not with air, but with a thick, yellowish paper. The forest wasn't killing its prey, it was repurposing it. He backed away, his boots crunching on the white powder, and that's when the natural sounds of the forest returned. A whippoorwill called from the trees, then another, then a third. But the calls were too perfect, too synchronized. They sounded like a digital recording on a loop. He bolted the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He checked his equipment, his fingers fumbling with the sensors. The Geiger counter remained silent, but his acoustic monitor was spiking into the red. There was a sound coming from beneath the cabin, a wet, grinding noise like stones being rubbed together underwater. Michael sat on the floor, his back against the heavy oak door, and tried to rationalize the irrational. He was a scientist. He believed in taxonomy, in the neat categorization of life. But what was happening in Blackwood Hollow defied the Darwinian ladder. It was a lateral evolution, a parasitic takeover that treated the entire ecosystem as a single modular organism. He remembered his father's stories about the Marrow Men, tales told by coal miners who claimed the mountains were hollow and filled with things that aided the light. He had laughed at those stories. He wasn't laughing now. The shadows in the room began to stretch, lengthening beyond the physics of the single kerosene lamp he had lit. Outside, the synchronized whippoorwill call stopped abruptly. In their place came a new sound. It was the sound of a woman crying. It was soft, melodic, and heart-wrenching. Michael froze. He knew that voice. It was the exact cadence of his wife Elena, who had died in a car accident in Seattle 2 years prior. "Michael," the voice whispered from the darkness of the woods. "Michael, it's so cold in the dirt." His rational mind screamed that it was a trap, a biological mimicry designed to lower his guard. Predators in the deep ocean used bioluminescence to lure prey. Predators in the Appalachian dark used grief. He approached the window, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird.
He peered through the grime-streaked glass. In the tree line, just past the reach of his lamp's yellow glow, I saw them. Pale, spindly shapes that moved with a twitching, insectoid grease. They weren't animals, and they weren't human. They were tall, translucent entities whose skin was so thin he could see the pulsing blue veins beneath. They didn't have faces, only wide vertical slits that hummed in that same low-frequency vibration. They were standing in a circle around the cabin, their long, multi-jointed fingers brushing against the bark of the trees. Every time they touched a tree, the wood seemed to shiver and turn gray. They were draining the forest, and now they had found a concentrated source of complex proteins and memories, Michael DaCosta. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The bloom stag on the table wasn't a warning, it was a blueprint. They were studying the local biology to better integrate themselves. The voice of Elena wasn't coming from a throat, it was being projected from the vibrating slits in their chests. They were harvesting his trauma, using his own psychological vulnerabilities to map his nervous system. Michael gripped the handle of his knife until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't just a witness anymore, he was a specimen. He looked at the stag's lungs, still pulsing with that yellow vapor, and realized that the vapor was now filling the cabin. It tasted like ozone. It tasted like the end of the world. As the first long, translucent finger slid through the gap in the window frame, Michael didn't scream. He simply watched, with a scientist's morbid curiosity, as his own skin began to turn the color of the ghost pipes in the dark. The pressure in Michael DaCosta's chest wasn't just the altitude of the West Virginian peaks. It was the realization that the silence of the Monongahela National Forest had teeth. He retreated from the clearing, his breath hitching in ragged, shallow bursts that tasted of ozone and ancient rot. Every snap of a twig under his boots sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive stillness of the hollow. He didn't look back. He knew that if he saw the thing, the pale, multi-jointed nightmare that had been watching from the shadows of the hemlocks, his mind would simply cease to function. He reached his cabin, a structure of weathered cedar and rusted tin that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb waiting to be sealed. Once inside, Michael threw the deadbolt, his hands shaking with such violence that the keys clattered against the wood like falling dice. He leaned his forehead against the cold timber of the door, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The psychological unraveling had begun. He could feel it in the way the corners of his vision frayed, the way the shadows in the room seemed to elongate and reach for him. It wasn't just fear. It was a profound ontological nausea. The world he knew, a world of logic, of forest management, of predictable wildlife, had been replaced by something grotesque and impossible. He felt the thin veneer of his sanity cracking, the jagged edges drawing blood from his subconscious. He stumbled to the kitchen table, the light from his kerosene lamp flickering, casting elongated dancing shapes against the walls. The cabin, which had belonged to his grandfather, Silas DaCosta, suddenly felt alien. He had come here to settle the estate, to find peace after a career of urban chaos, but the peace was a lie. He noticed a floorboard near the hearth that sat slightly higher than the others. Driven by a frantic need for distraction, he pried it up with a heavy-hitting pocket knife. Beneath lay a bundle of oilskin-wrapped papers, smelling of damp earth and iron. As Michael unwrapped the bundle, his fingers brushed against a leather-bound logbook. The dates inside were from the 1950s, the handwriting a frantic, jagged scrawl that mirrored his own current mental state. This was the mid-story reveal that shifted the gravity of his terror. His grandfather hadn't died of natural causes in his sleep as the family had claimed. Silas had been documenting the harvest. The entries spoke of the things between the trees, creatures that didn't consume flesh but marrow and memory. And more chillingly, Silas had been feeding them, not out of malice but out of a desperate ancestral pact. They demand a lineage, one entry read, the ink smeared as if by a trembling hand. They do not take the stranger. They wait for the blood that belongs to the mountain. Michael felt a cold sweat break across his neck. The realization was a physical blow. He wasn't a victim of random chance. He was an inheritance. He was the next payment in a debt he never signed for. Outside, the scratching began. It wasn't the sound of an animal seeking warmth. It was a rhythmic, deliberate scratching of something hard, like chitin or bone, against the cedar siding of the cabin. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was moving around the perimeter, testing the wood, feeling for a weakness in the structure, or perhaps in Michael's mind. The smell of the woods began to seep through the cracks in the floorboards, not the fresh scent of pine, but the cloying, sweet stench of a slaughterhouse left in the sun. Michael's internal monologue began to fracture. He found himself whispering to the empty room, answering the scratching. I'm not him. I'm not Silas. But the mountain didn't care about names. It cared about the resonance of the soul. He looked at his reflection in the darkened window, and for a fleeting, horrific second, his eyes didn't look like their own. They looked like the pale, milky orbs of the thing he had glimpsed in the clearing. He grabbed his shotgun from the rack, the cold steel providing a momentary anchor to reality. But even as he checked the shells, he noticed the walls were sweating. A thick, viscous sap was oozing from the logs, a deep amber fluid that smelled of bile and iron. The cabin was breathing with him. The escalation was no longer external. The environment was morphing to suit the predator. The creature outside let out a sound, a low, clicking trill that vibrated in Michael's teeth. It wasn't a growl, it was a mimicry of a human sob, distorted and pitched to a frequency that bypasses the ears and strikes directly at the amygdala. Panic, raw and unfiltered, surged through him. He began to hallucinate, seeing the cabin walls dissolve into the gray mists of the Appalachian peaks. He saw his grandfather standing in the corner, his mouth sewn shut with silver wire, pointing toward the door. The shattering truth was beginning to germinate in his mind. The creature wasn't just outside. It was a manifestation of the land's hunger, and his family was its chosen conduit. Every breath he took in this forest was an invitation. Every drop of sweat he shed was a map for the harvester. Suddenly the scratching stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before, a physical weight that made it hard to draw air into its lungs. Then a voice, thin, reedy, and sounding exactly like his mother, who had died 10 years ago, whispered from just outside the door. "Michael, it's cold. Let us in." The impossibility of it shattered the last of his composure. He knew it wasn't her. He knew it was a lure, a biological trap designed by a predator that had hunted his bloodline for centuries. Yet his hand moved toward the bolt, a primal, subconscious compulsion overriding his survival instinct. The horror wasn't just that he was being hunted. It was that a part of him wanted to surrender to the mountain, to become part of the dark, anaerobic mud that lines the hollows of West Virginia. He was Michael DaCosta, but here in the shadow of the Monongahela, he was merely a harvest waiting to be reaped. The cabin didn't offer sanctuary, it offered a cage. Michael DaCosta slammed the heavy oak door, throwing the iron bolt with fingers that felt like numb, frozen sausages. He leaned his forehead against the cold timber of the door, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The air in the Monongahela National Forest hummed with that same unnatural frequency.
A low-pitched vibration that rattled his molars and made the fluid in his inner ear itch. It was the sound of the mountains breathing, or perhaps the sound of something deep within the limestone karst digestive system of West Virginia finally waking up. He leaned his back against the door, feeling the rough-hewn timber vibrate. Something was on the other side, not tapping, not scratching, just pressing. A heavy, monolithic weight leaned against the wood, as if the forest itself were trying to reclaim the space Michael occupied. His psychological perimeter had breached miles ago. The cold sweat wasn't just a byproduct of the Appalachian chill. It was a physical manifestation of his soul's desire to exit his body. He could feel the nausea coiling in his gut like a nest of copper-headed snakes. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the black, anaerobic mud from the hollow, shifting and churning with a life that defied biology. He staggered toward the kitchen, his boots clattering on the floorboards that groaned with the weight of generations. This cabin had belonged to his grandfather, Silas DaCosta, a man who had vanished into the Allegheny mist 40 years ago. Michael had come here to settle the estate, to bury the ghosts of a broken lineage, but the ghosts were refusing to stay in the ground. He fumbled for the kerosene lamp on the scarred pine table. The match flared, a tiny, defiant sun in the encroaching gloom. As the light bloomed, Michael gasped. The walls were weeping. Not water, but a thick, viscous amber resin that smelled of ancient pine and rusted iron. It oozed from the chinking between the logs, forming slow, deliberate patterns that looked disturbingly like nerve endings. He reached out, his hand trembling, to touch the substance. It was warm. It pulsed. He pulled back, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was the mid-story reveal he hadn't been prepared for. The cabin wasn't a structure built on top of the land. It was an extension of the thing beneath it. The wood was still alive, still connected to a subterranean network of roots and mycelium that spanned the entire hollow. Desperation drove him to the cellar door. He remembered his father's hushed warnings about the deep veins of the DaCosta land. He wrenched the cellar door open, the hinges screaming in a voice that sounded too much like a human cry. He descended the stone steps, the air growing thick with the sense of ozone and wet fur. His flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on a stack of old leather-bound ledgers tucked into a niche in the foundation. He grabbed the top one, the leather feeling like cured human skin. He flipped it open to a page dated October 1983. His grandfather's handwriting was a frantic scrawl. "It does not eat the flesh. It eats the history. It mimics the blood to become the man. I can hear my own voice calling from the trees, but I am standing right here. The weaver is coming for the dead." Michael felt a cold spike of ice drive through his spine. The Pale Weaver. The name echoed in his mind, a forgotten nursery rhyme turned into a death sentence. Suddenly, the silence upstairs was broken. A sound drifted down the cellar stairs. It was the sound of a key turning in the front door. Then the heavy thud of boots, identical to his own. Then a voice. It wasn't a monster's growl. It was his own voice. "Michael, you in there, buddy? It's okay, I'm back." The voice was a perfect crystalline replica of his own mid-Atlantic accent, right down to the slight rasp from his pack-a-day habit. But Michael was in the cellar. Michael was alone. The thing upstairs was pacing the floorboards now, the heavy, rhythmic tread of a man who knew exactly where the cellar door was. He backed away from the stairs, his flashlight beam dancing wildly. He hit the back wall of the cellar and felt something soft. He turned. The wall wasn't stone anymore. It was a mesh of white, fibrous silk,
thick as bridge cables, pulsating with a rhythmic bioluminescent glow. Encased within the silk were objects, not bodies, but memories. A rusted pocket watch he'd lost as a child, his mother's wedding ring, a photograph of him from last Christmas. The creature wasn't just hunting him, it was harvesting him. It was stripping the layers of his identity to clothe itself. The natural twist hit him with the force of a physical blow. The creature didn't want his life, it wanted his place in the world. It wanted to walk out of the forest as Michael DaCosta, leaving the original to rot as a hollowed-out husk in the Appalachian dark. Outside, the wind picked up, shrieking through the rhododendron thickets like a choir of the damned. The footsteps upstairs stopped right at the cellar door. The latch clicked. Michael extinguished his flashlight, plunging himself into a darkness so total it felt like drowning. He could hear the heavy breathing of his double at the top of the stairs. It wasn't breathing air. It sounded like it was breathing liquid, a wet, gurgling sound that mimicked the rhythm of a human lung. "I found the ledgers, Michael," the voice said from the dark. "I know about the debt. Don't worry. I'll pay it for us." Michael gripped a rusted wood axe he found leaning against a wall, his knuckles white. The psychological fracturing was complete. He no longer knew if the man upstairs was the monster or if he was the ghost watching his own life be stolen. The cabin began to groan, the logs twisting and warping as the resin flow increased. The very floorboards he stood on began to soften, turning into a peat-like substance that threatened to swallow his boots. He realized then that the forest didn't have boundaries. The cabin, the cellar, the trees, and the thing upstairs were all part of a single vast organism, an apex predator of the metaphysical. He smelled the copper again, stronger now, filling his sinuses until he felt he would choke. The cellar door creaked open. A sliver of moonlight spilled down the stairs, illuminating a pair of boots, his boots. They were covered in the same black mud from the hollow. As the figure began to descend, Michael saw the fingers gripping the railing. They were too long, the skin translucent and pale, stretched over bone that looked like polished ivory. But the face, as it leaned into the light, Michael saw his own eyes looking back at him. Not yellow or red, but his own hazel eyes, filled with a terrifying simulated warmth. "Move over, Michael," the thing whispered. "It's time to go home." He swung the axe. The blade bit into the wooden railing, missing the creature by an inch. The creature didn't flinch. It simply smiled, a smile that was slightly too wide, revealing rows of teeth that were needles of bone. The realization of his own obsolescence shattered what was left of his sanity. He wasn't the protagonist of this story. He was the raw material. He turned and ran deeper into the dark of the cellar, where the silk was thickest, his screams muffled by the weight of the mountain above him. He was no longer Michael DaCosta. He was a debt being collected by the Monongahela. The vibration didn't just rattle Michael DaCosta's teeth anymore. It was beginning to liquefy his sense of reality. The iron bolt he had slammed home in Chapter 3 was now humming a low, dissonant chord that resonated through the very marrow of his finger bones. He backed away from the door, his boots thudding against the wide-planked oak floors of the West Virginian cabin. Every shadow in the room seemed to have gained mass, becoming a viscous, oily pool that threatened to swallow the weak yellow beam of his flashlight. The smell of copper, once a faint metallic tang, was now an overwhelming stench of a slaughterhouse floor, raw, iron-rich, and ancient. Michael's psychological state was a fraying rope. His mind, once a sharp instrument of logic and pragmatism, was now a shattered mirror reflecting 1,000 distorted images of his own terror. He felt a cold sweat prickling his scalp, not from the chill of the Appalachian night, but from the internal nausea of knowing that the cabin's walls were no longer a barrier. They were a skin, and something outside was trying to peel it back. He collapsed against the kitchen counter, his breath coming in jagged, wheezing hitches. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking so violently that he could barely grip the heavy maglite. Underneath his fingernails, the skin had turned a bruised metallic blue, as if the very iron in his blood was reacting to the frequency outside. He needed to move. Standing still was an invitation to the madness. Michael began to pace the narrow confines of the living room, his eyes darting to the boarded-up windows. Between the gaps in the wood, he saw it, not a creature of flesh and fur, but a shimmering distortion in the air, a ripple of heat in the freezing night. It was as if the forest itself was folding in on a central point. The Monongahela wasn't just a collection of trees, but a hungry, sentient geology. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The teeth he had sensed earlier weren't the fangs of a beast, but the jagged outcroppings of the mountain itself, grinding together in a slow tectonic hunger. Searching for a weapon, Michael tore open the utility closet under the stairs. His hands scrambled through old fishing tackle and rusted tools until they landed on a heavy, leather-bound ledger tucked behind a stack of moth-eaten blankets. He pulled it out, the spine cracking like a dry bone. This was the mid-story reveal he hadn't asked for, a natural but devastating discovery left by the cabin's previous inhabitant. The handwriting was a frantic scrawl that devolved into geometric patterns toward the end. It doesn't eat the flesh, the entry from October 1974 read. It consumes the frequency. It rewrites the iron in the blood until you are just another vein in the mountain. Michael felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that felt like it was trying to sync with the humming of the cabin. He wasn't being hunted. He was being assimilated. The entity was a localized manifestation of the Monongahela's ancient mineral consciousness. It was the great silence of the hollows made manifest, a predator that operates on the level of molecular vibration. He realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated horror that the metallic scent wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from his own pores. He wiped his forehead and his hand came away streaked with a dark silver-gray sludge. His body was starting to change, his biological matter transmuting into something inorganic, something that belonged to the cold, hard earth of West Virginia. Suddenly, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the vibration. It was a vacuum, a total absence of sound that Michael's ears bled. He stood in the center of the kitchen, paralyzed, watching as the floorboards began to weep. A dark, viscous liquid seeped upward through the cracks, smelling of deep earth ore and stagnant water. It didn't pool like water. It rose in thin, needle-like spires, reaching toward his boots. He scrambled backward, tripping over a chair, his scream dying in his throat as he realized he couldn't make a sound. The air in his lungs had become too heavy, too thick with the scent of iron to vibrate his vocal cords. From the darkness of the hallway, a shape emerged. It wasn't the monster he had expected. It was a mockery of a human form, translucent and shimmering with that same heat-haze distortion. As it stepped into the faint light, its features flickered like a dying television screen. For a second, it looked like his father, the same square jaw, the same weary eyes. But the eyes were nothing more than polished hematite spheres, cold and unreflecting. Then it shifted, becoming a distorted version of Michael himself. It moved with a mechanical, jerky gait, its joints clicking with the sound of stones grinding together. This was the foreshadowing of the end. The mountain didn't just kill, it replaced. It took the memories,
The form and the essence of the intruder and forged them into a sentinel for the hollow. The creature raised a hand made of crystallized carbon and jagged iron, and pointed at Michael's chest. The frequency returned, but this time it wasn't a low hum. It was a high-pitched, crystalline shriek that shattered every piece of glassware in the cabin. The windows, the mirrors, the old whiskey bottles, all exploded in a synchronized burst of shards. Michael felt the glass slice into his skin, but he didn't bleed red. He bled silver. The pain was secondary to the existential dread that flooded his mind. He was losing his self, the boundaries of Michael DaCosta dissolving into the mineral wealth of the Appalachian Range. He tried to scramble toward the back door, his limbs heavy and stiffening like cooling lead. Outside, the forest began to glow with an eerie, bioluminescent green, reflecting off the low-hanging clouds. The trees weren't swaying in the wind, they were vibrating in unison with the creature in the hallway. Michael reached the door, his fingers fumbling with the latch, but his hands were no longer his own. The skin had fused into a solid gray gauntlet of stone and metal. He looked back one last time, seeing the entity standing amidst the swirling shards of glass, its face now a perfect, terrifyingly blank replica of his own. It wasn't just a predator, it was a successor. The Monongahela had found a new voice, a new vein to tap into, and as Michael finally forced the door open, he didn't see the woods. He saw a landscape of shifting, metallic geometry that stretched on forever into the dark American night. The nightmare wasn't ending, it was finally reaching its resonant peak, and he was the instrument it was playing. The vibration wasn't a sound anymore, it was a physical occupation. Michael DaCosta slumped against the kitchen counter, his knuckles white as he gripped the formica edge. The rhythmic thrumming he had felt in his teeth during the previous hours had migrated, sinking through his gums, down his esophagus, and into the very architecture of his skeleton. It felt as if his bones were being tuned like the strings of a grand, rusted piano. Outside, the Appalachian night was no longer dark. It was a bruised, heavy purple, the clouds over the Monongahela peaks swirling in a localized vortex that defied every law of meteorology he had ever known. His breath came out in sharp, silver plumes. The air inside the cabin had dropped to a temperature that shouldn't have been possible in a West Virginian autumn. It was the cold of deep space, or perhaps the cold of the Earth's deep, pressurized mantle. He looked at his hands. Under the flickering yellow light of the single overhead bulb, his veins didn't look blue or red, they looked black. Not the black of bruising, but the shimmering, iridescent black of oil or liquid magnetite. When he flexed his fingers, he heard a sound, a dry, grinding mechanical rasp, like two river stones being rubbed together under immense pressure.
The horror of it didn't hit him with a scream. It hit him with a cold, analytical realization. The creature he had been fearing, the thing he thought was stalking the perimeter of the cabin, wasn't looking for a way in, it was looking for a way out. And it was currently wearing Michael DaCosta like a cheap suit. He stumbled toward the bathroom, his legs moving with a heavy, staccato gait that felt entirely alien. Every step caused the floorboards to groan, not from his weight, but from some gravitational shift he was trailing behind him. He reached the cracked mirror above the sink. The face staring back was his, yet it wasn't. His skin had taken on the texture of weathered shale. His eyes, once a mundane hazel, were now terrifyingly vibrant. The pupils had dilated into jagged rectangular slits, mimicking the horizontal gaze of a goat or some prehistoric prey animal. But he wasn't the prey. He could smell the copper and iron now with a clarity that was agonizing. He could smell the mineral deposits 300 feet below the cabin. He could hear the slow, tectonic groan of the Appalachian plates grinding against one another, a sound that resonated in his chest like a heartbeat. "It's not an infection," he whispered. His voice sounded like gravel pouring down a tin chute. "It's a reclamation." He remembered the legends the locals in Elkins had whispered about, the old ones of the ridge, the entities that weren't biological in any sense humans understood. They were geological. They were the spirit of the mountain given a terrible, heavy consciousness. The metallic scent that had followed him since Chapter 1 wasn't a warning. It was a pheromone, a chemical signal calling the iron in his blood back to its source. Michael grabbed a kitchen knife, his mind fracturing as he pressed the blade against his forearm. He didn't want to see blood, he needed to know. He sliced. There was no pain, only a sensation of extreme pressure being released. No red spurted out. Instead, a thick, viscous sludge of liquefied hematite and silver seeped from the wound, crawling across his skin with a mind of its own, seeking the floor, seeking the earth. Suddenly, the cabin walls began to buckle inward. The iron bolt he had slammed home, the one that had been humming, was now glowing with a dull, cherry-red heat. The metal was melting, but it wasn't dripping down. It was being pulled toward him. The nails in the wall, the cast-iron skillet on the stove, the very springs in the mattress in the corner, they were all vibrating in a frenzied magnetic symphony. Michael realized then that he was the epicenter. The Monongahela wasn't hunting him. It was consuming his humanity to provide a vessel for something that had been trapped in the dark shale for 1 billion years. The creature was the mountain itself, and it was using his nervous system as a bridge into the physical world. He tried to scream, but his jaw locked. The calcification was accelerating. His skin began to harden into a dark metallic carapace. He saw his reflection one last time before the mirror shattered under the sheer force of the acoustic frequency. He saw the transition. Michael DaCosta was disappearing, replaced by a jagged, obsidian-skinned entity that looked like a statue carved from a nightmare. He felt his memories, his childhood in Pittsburgh, his wife's face, the smell of Sunday morning coffee, being filed away into a cold, inorganic archive. They were just data points now, useless to the tectonic intelligence currently rewriting his DNA. The cabin door finally gave way, but not from an external force. It simply disintegrated into dust, the iron hardware flying toward Michael and embedding itself into his chest, merging with his new form like shrapnel returning to a magnet. He stepped out onto the porch. The forest was silent now. The teeth he had felt in the silence were no longer threatening because he was the jaw. The trees seemed to bow as he passed, their roots sensing the ancient power now walking among them. He wasn't Michael DaCosta anymore. He was a sentinel of the Monongahela, a living monolith of iron and ancient spite. He looked up at the stars, but they no longer looked like distant suns. They looked like flaws in a great canopy. He realized the final truth. Humanity was never the master of this land. We were just the soft, carbon-based mulch intended to feed the real owners when they decided to wake up. As he walked into the dark heart of the hollow, his footprints left glowing, radioactive impressions in the mud. The transition was complete. The vibration stopped. The silence returned. But this time it was a silence of absolute, undisputed dominion. The mountain had its voice back, and it was made of Michael's bones.